Now we can take questions from the audience. There's a mic that's going to go around. By the way, I was just going to throw out some more interesting factoids for entertainment. Whatever it is that DRI does or accomplishes, we do it on 0.3% of the budget of the other side. So is that good value for money? You decide. Let's take this first question.
Mr. Riesely, on your dumb solution finding system, it seems to me that anything you find will quite often be a dumb solution. You go to fast foods in this country, and now going around the world. What it produces is a major health problem. You go to something else like the use of illegal drugs. They certainly take off, and people will go to any lengths to get them. But the results are quite disastrous for the country. We're spending money for drugs on people that are causing disasters in the countries that they live in, from Afghanistan to Mexico.
Thank you. Next. I should have mentioned, by the way, and this is not a comment on your comment, please try to keep your remarks extremely brief and try to make them a question rather than a statement as much as possible to engage in dialogue with our speakers. Next, please.
Actually, can I jump in over here?
Oh, yeah, sure, go
Thanks.
ahead. It's a democracy.
So the debate between Big Push versus RCT has attracted a lot of attention, but I think sometimes in these binary debates it's interesting to see what's elided, and that's politics. So we'd never actually talk about how these supposedly technical solutions will lead to systems-oriented change, to invoke what the gentleman just said. And it's ironic in a way that development keeps talking about development outside of the realm of the political, especially here where Occupy Wall Street marched down the street outside just last week. And so I'm wondering, and this is for Bill, within your kind of experimentation hypothesis, how much can we talk about dismantling the strictures of global capitalism that lead to extraction, abuse, and general immiseration while we have these little sandcastle projects that try to build places we've destroyed back up again?
I had a question for Michael. You mentioned that aid money has always been scarce, it is scarce and always will be scarce, and you use that as an argument to suggest that the evaluation approach is most important because there's not very much money out there, so let's make sure we get the best bang for our buck. My question to you is, what does the evaluation approach do about increasing the amount of aid that's out there? Because that seems to be something the goal approach is really providing that I can't see how the evaluation approach does.
Hi, my name is Brian Turner. I'm a Master's of Development Practice student at Columbia. So I had a question for Bernadette and a question for
Welcome,
Michael.
Columbia.
Michael, in your paper, you put up some slides showing what's happening in the Millennium Villages, mirroring national trends. But even when you do the differences in differences, like focusing on the brochure, the Harvest of Development report, overall the finding is that the villages are doing quite well. And I think for the American, or for the Journal of Nutrition article, which you replied to, I think the Millennium Villages reply was that even when looking at changes within that particular time frame, the stunting reduction was about 5 times faster, even comparing within the time frame that you said in your comment. And I think they also mentioned that they thought perhaps that you'd failed to differentiate between children under 5 and children under 2 years old. So I was just hoping you could comment on that.
No, that's not true.
And for Bernadette, I think of the 5 control villages, 2 of them actually got over $100,000 worth of inputs from the Millennium Villages. And I think there's been some criticisms on 7 out of the 10 indicators that you used for the propensity score matching not being done appropriately, as well as failing to use imputed values for agricultural production. So I was just hoping you could comment on that. Thanks.
Hello, thank you. My question is for both the goals and the evaluation teams, if that's how we're dividing it. A failure that I see from this project in the beginning, and I'm not sure if it was in the conversation at the time that the Millennium Goals were being discussed, was, and it is being discussed much more now, this idea that Africa, and specifically sub-Saharan Africa, can be solved with one solution, and that Kenya, I mean, just looking at the evaluations, we have a Kenya evaluation and a Ghana evaluation, and that they are both then being extrapolated to see how the entire program works. I'm wondering, as we move forward and we really start to regionalize, especially within this continent, is there a new conversation about, once the Millennium Goals end, how we can start to scale down these projects and localize and work with local leaders instead of trying to implement something for an entire continent?
Hi. This is mainly for Bernadette, but Michael can also take this. Thanks. So you mentioned that when the government almost had nothing to do with the villages and the project, and that is also my experience from India. Like the corruption study got probably more focus in Northeast US than in India, and nothing has really changed. So my question is, do you think there is any way to engage government, even the good projects, the projects which has had proper evaluation, so that there is some kind of institutional change, and not these projects are like piecemeal efforts of researchers? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sachs. I'm also from Colombia. My question is to Bernadette. You mentioned that there was no, that the households could be worse off because their income, there was a reduction in remittances. I was wondering if you evaluated other indices of welfare, because I think it's generally known that income is not the only measure. So did you consider education, schooling levels, and health, and other indicators to assess whether the project made an impact? And I have another question for Michael. The figure you mentioned, the $27.1 million, was that for the period of 5 years? Yeah, so I did the calculation, and it comes down to $492 per person per year. And I was just wondering if you thought that was too much of an investment to make. Thank you.
Still 33,000.
Francisco Bozano, tenure in ecology. I also speak at Columbia, and I'm very glad to hear this other point of view, and it really makes New York a special place. I think that the dichotomy established here for the purpose of the dialogue between goals and evaluations is really a false dichotomy, because how can you evaluate if you don't have goals? Like how can you establish goals if you don't do evaluation? I think the biggest flaw I've seen in all the Millennium Villages is that they're making it hard for external people to evaluate. And that's for me, the serious criticism that's been made, and it's been made by somebody from the diaspora, which brings me to the next point. Doesn't the diaspora have a big role to play when we have lack of capacity in many African countries, and we have so many capable Africans here? Shouldn't we listen to them much more? Hasn't this lady made a very strong case in this direction? Thank you.
My question is for Bill and Stuart. I agree with your context, cost context and conservation bill in dumb finding systems. And as a dumb finding system myself, also known as a social entrepreneur, what would you say are the systemic barriers in non-private aid and the hidden barriers for social entrepreneurs? And what are those barriers, and what can we do as a society to bring down those barriers to go ahead and enable the dumb finding systems?
Hi, I have a double disclaimer to make. I work in the United Nations Development Program and a part-time student at Columbia. But I'm speaking here as a Mongolian. Basically, I have a question to Michael Clemens, disguised as a statement. or a statement disguised as a question. So I think to some extent, probably we need to start isolating the Jeffrey Sachs effect, because Jeffrey Sachs was at like the public face of implementation of shock therapy policies, not on a village scale, but on the massive regional scale in Central and Eastern European and Central Asian countries. So, I mean, so basically like 20 years ago, there was a public statement that he made saying if these policies are implemented, structural adjustment policies are implemented, your economy will go back to normal in 6 years. It took 10 years to go back to normal, and it is many of the countries in the region haven't actually rebounded back even now. So my question is, how would you categorize the phenomenon of using unproven economic theories for applying as macroeconomic policies for developing countries? In which camp would you place them?
Hi, there's been some interesting points today, but just maybe a plea that it would be wonderful, because there's so much money in play in international development, to move beyond just DRI and Jeff Sachs to much larger scale discussions. There's a lot more than $100 million being spent on this issue. But I would love to hear Stuart's thoughts about entrepreneurship. You know, I was just at South by Southwest. There were a lot of startups there and a lot of businesses. There were very few people from developing countries. You know, what kind of approaches could we take to have more conversations about pure entrepreneurship? I have to believe there's more than one Mo Ibrahim on the continent. You know, there's a lot of smaller Mo Ibrahims, a lot of people with some good business ideas. How can we support them, get them in front of angel investors, get them in front of VC funds more? What could we do in a solid way instead of having an international development conference where we talk about business? How do we get business leaders with business leaders, tech startups with tech startups, instead of these specialized interactions? So thanks.
Hey, how you doing? My name is Ace Valentine, and my question is for Bernadette. She mentioned about the spillover effect from the Millennium Villages to the small communities, and she said, or to the outlying communities, rather. She said that there was no spillover effect, and she mentioned the feeding programs. You mentioned that when you were a child, there were feeding programs that were already in establishment. What I want to know, and this actually goes to the home front as well, how do we, if they haven't stopped, how do we make those feeding programs expand, and what can you take, using Bill's analogy of taking local input, what can you take from your experiences, and how can we apply that to the Millennium Villages to make them better?
Hi, my name is Eduardo, and I'm as well a student at Columbia University on the MPA program. And my question is to Michael. Michael, what do you think about when you presented the budget and you divided by the per capita investment? What would be your take within comparing that exercise with the exercise of doing the New York City budget within each of the New Yorkers that live here? Meaning that I think some of the budget implies services, implies the construction of infrastructure like water, sewage, and from my perspective, that will be the same as comparing the cost of policemen for we to be walking freely and safely in the city. Don't you think that will be kind of in odds to be comparing the budget like that?
Good day, my name is Ken Johnson, principal of DevConio, which is an international development firm focused on sub-Saharan Africa.
Speak up a little, please.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, I'm hopefully thinking that I'm one of the diaspora that was mentioned that should be listened to, so hopefully I can get some traction here. First of all, I think one of the problems that many African diasporas say is that too many of these projects are, devised and developed out in the capitals of the United States and England and France. Why aren't they led by the local Africans? That's point number one. Point number two, Africa has about 2,000 languages, and if one describes culture as a language surrounded by a group of norms, then we typically have 2,000 cultures. And to the lady that mentioned the importance of ensuring that projects must be such that it takes into account the local culture is critically important, and that has been vitally missing. What are we going to do about that? And to Stuart, I can suggest to you that there are a number of projects that I can I can tell you that the African diaspora have thought about that are not only scalable, profitable, and sustainable. I think when we look at Africa, we often think that, oh, we'll just do a little bit of microfinance here and a little bit of microfinance over there. Africa requires large, scalable, sustainable business models, and we ought to start thinking about poverty reduction to wealth creation. So I'd like to address that. Thank you.
Susana Martinez, Columbia University, and UNDP. In my dissertation, I'm graduating in May, I'm working with randomized experiments, and I have gone through all that, but I'm very critical, and now in my job, in real experience, I have seen how we don't have the money to implement necessarily randomized experiments, but there's a huge gap between the political willing of enlarging a program starting from 1,000 people to 300,000 people in 1 year, and people that have no idea how to design a program and have no clear goals. And so I'm right now trying to think about a new way of evaluating without necessarily having a randomized. And this is very interesting because I think you were thinking about the same, but this was a little bit critical of what we have seen, but I would like to hear some of your ideas of how we could create like a sort of cheap evaluation where we take into account local experiences and civil society, but where we can help them out to identify a goal, because I have seen that some local projects don't even have a clear goal. So I don't know if you have some examples in Africa where there's an evaluation participating, some quantitative measures, some qualitative measures, and if you can share that for Bill and Michael. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Rebecca. I'm a New School student. I've heard a lot of talk about how we're looking at agriculture, and over the last 20 years, official development to agriculture has decreased significantly. And also the whole kind of international political spectrum that deals with agriculture and how agriculture has to be approached in terms of international trade laws has become very, very difficult. But meanwhile, all these people are still working in agriculture, and it's one of the best indicators of development of a country out there in terms of what the trajectory might be in the future. I'm just curious as to what sorts of new development initiatives focused more towards agriculture might be out there, and how those are dealing with all of these new intellectual property problems and international trade issues.
Hi, I have a question for Bernadette. Did you see in your study any impact or any changes in institutions in the Millennium Village? Specifically, for example, if there is an enhancement in accountability, if there is a lower corruption, or I mean, if Millennium Villages have any impact in institutional development and performance. And the question, I think, for all of you, and echoing Stuart a bit, what's next? I mean, is there anything positive that we can draw on to kind of engage in a different discussion? I think it is very important to have a critical approach to Millennium Villages, but there will be a point, if we are not yet there, in which there needs to turn into a more positive discussion as well, because, you know, 2015 is around the corner, and what's next?
Hi, my name is Maria Wang. I'm also from Columbia University. I work for Dr. Porponik, the Director of Monitoring and Evaluation for the Millennium Villages Project. None of my comments here are to defend him in any way. I am simply seeking to understand, because I am also, like you, motivated by the movement towards development outcomes, and I'm seeking to, I care about causality and impact and accountability. The panel today has been really interesting, but it seems very heavy on debates and development, but light on the search for answers, which is the other aspect of today's conference. And I wondered if we could focus a little more on the search for answers, and to me that is a search for common ground. So with that in mind, I wondered if Bill and Michael could comment on how to reconcile their two main theses. So where does the entrepreneurial customer feedback model fit into the goals movement versus the evaluation movement? Where is the room for that? And related to that as well, I see the MVPs as being a bit caught between a rock and a hard place. So Bill, on the one hand, is accusing the MVP as using gold to create Kleenexes, but then on the other hand, Michael is holding MVPs up to a higher standard and saying that there should be a diamond standard. we should be more rigorous with our RCTs. So where does the answer lie? How do you reconcile those two? Thank you.
Hi, I'm
sorry,
a master's student from Yale University, and I'd like to pose this question to the panelists, all three of them. Given that during a randomized controlled trial, you're essentially randomly selecting a control group to not receive the perceived, what you want to ascertain to be a desired treatment, I'm curious to hear, to what extent such ethical considerations play into the dialogue between academics and multilateral organizations or even development funds, and whether that, to what extent that gets factored into the dialogue.
Hi, I'm actually an author of a book called What the U.S. Can Learn from China. And I'm actually interested in hearing from all the panelists what you think of China's development of Africa. Thanks.
Okay. All right, we're incredibly short of time. I will give one quick generic response to the general question of, why are you always so negative? Why don't you come up with some answer? Something positive, something constructive. Well, I think that question is missing the point. The point is, don't look at some middle-aged white male academic to solve Africa's problems. Let's have political and economic freedom for Africans to solve their own problems. That's all I'm going to say. Now, for the panel, you have the impossible task of responding to incredibly intelligent, detailed questions in no time at all. You have 1 minute each to summarize what you think is summarize your major thrust of your response to all the questions.
Can I go ahead?
Sure.
So, the per capita calculation that the lady did, $492 per person. Income is $60 per person, so that's 8 times income. If you went to one of the people in the village that Bernadette grew up in and asked them, do you want your income to be multiplied by 8 times for 5 years, or do you want this project? What do you think they'd say? They'd say, give me the money unless you can show me that you're going to make me better off without that and doing this project. And also the calculation I did stands, they're spending 33 times income per capita as a one-off. Brian from Columbia points out that the project has had impacts. Of course it's had impacts. If I'm going to spend 8 times income per capita in a remote village of Africa, of course people are going to be made better off, and that's charity, and I admire charity, and Stuart pointed out that hundreds of thousands of people have been made better off by this project, and that's a wonderful thing. What we said in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition wasn't that they hadn't shown impacts. There's definitely impacts. It's that they concealed the fact that there was a background rate of change, and we forced them to admit it. We never said, and I will never say that they haven't had impacts. It's obvious that with tons of money flowing into a place where there is no economy, there's no modern economic growth, there are no institutions, you can create some good change. But there has to be a longer term vision for development than that. The last thing I just want to mention, what does the evaluation movement do for increasing aid flows? In my personal opinion, a part of building the long-term constituency for foreign aid is not misrepresenting its impacts to voters, but being honest about failure and about what works and what doesn't. That's what's going to support foreign aid in the long term, and long term is when development happens, not by 3 years from now.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to selectively answer a couple of questions, and also in reference to one point. I don't think that you can annualize a per-person expenditure of building a system. I'm building a new building for my foundation. I don't look at it as an investment, a one-time investment per person. I look at it as a systematic construction over a long period of time. In terms of the questions on entrepreneurship, I think the way you solve entrepreneurship is to deal with risk return. The problem with venture capital, and particularly the problem with venture capital in emerging markets, in developing markets rather than emerging markets, is it doesn't have venture capital returns. U.S. venture capital pays back. If you hit a home run, you get 40 times your money. And that allows you to offset all the things you lose on. If you hit a home run in an emerging market, first of all, the probability is lower and the returns are lower. And therefore, you need to find a way to reprice the risk. And that's the only way you're going to get VCs to be funded, is to reprice the risk and to build capital markets. And I would rather see personally, first of all, I hate the concept of aid. I wish we would do away with the concept of aid and figure out something else. And I would love to see a large chunk of that go to reprice risk in these markets. And then you can have Africans build solutions for Africa, or Indians build solutions for India. But it's all a question of risk return. The question on China, I think, is very interesting. I personally think that China has the potential to play an extremely positive role, but you have to level the playing fields. Today, when China offers infrastructure for concessions, you need to empower the country that is receiving that offer to properly value the infrastructure and then hold the investor accountable for delivering. It's obviously a much longer story, but I think there is real room to think about how does China play a very, very constructive role in development. In terms of the diaspora ideas and investments, Soros Economic Development Fund, 1700 Broadway, please call it right. You know, we would love to look at ideas that make sense. We've got a lot of money to put to work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll also respond selectively. I think my major comments came from colleagues from Columbia University, and one question was about the use of propensity score matching. I think that is an acceptable non-experimental design that is used in impact evaluation, and it has been shown that you can get accurate results when you combine with regression methods. So whoever asked, if you look in literature, it's acceptable. And I think it is also in line with someone who asked if there is any other way of evaluating projects without having a randomized control experiment. And in my opinion, I think the propensity score matching works without a baseline. So long as you meet the control variables that are required. Now, the other question of spillover effects, I think this is something we got comments from Colombia and we've put into consideration. And preliminary results show that even if we take into control the spillover effects, there is still no effect. And that is why we felt that it's important to actually be accurate in terms of what you are talking about when you are referring to spillover effect. Now, in terms of the government role, the government I know can play a role, but for this particular project, the way it was conceived, I think they didn't see the government playing any role. The only role the government must have played was maybe to show the targeted beneficiaries, to show the location. But in terms of implementation, I think the project went straight to the community and started working with the community. So far, there is really no link between the government and the project. As a way forward, I think someone said it's all criticism. I think if we understand the major role of monitoring and evaluation is to enable redesign. So for us, actually, is a way of showing that there is a need to go back to the drawing board to see how we can improve on what we have rather than stop what we are doing. So for Millennium Village, we are not saying that it is rubbish, it can't work. We are saying that it can work, but with some redesign. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank all of our speakers for a wonderful session. Thank you so much.